Hello, this is the Stories Beside channel. I release videos every day for you. Subscribe and click the bell.
Adriana was once again admiring the sunset, sitting on the shore of the lake. She had her brushes in her hands and her easel next to her. Spending time painting, she lost track of time, completely immersed in her occupation. Drawing? Love. From her earliest childhood, she always tried to transfer to paper everything she liked, or vice versa, all her thoughts and experiences, and she was also very fond of nature. No detail escapes her attentive eye. She depicted the smallest strokes with remarkable precision. Adriana's mother could always understand what mood her daughter was in. After all, her paintings and drawings spoke more eloquently than any words. One glance was enough to tell. Memories of her mother, who had left the world so early, hurt her heart. Adriana had been very close to her mother. She seemed to her the epitome of femininity and beauty. After all, there was simply no other way to think of her. She seemed to warm everyone around her with her radiant smile, and it was impossible not to fall in love with her kind eyes. Adriana idolized her mother, as well as her father, although he had a completely different personality. Father loved Adriana's mom madly. They had traveled a very difficult path together, which led them to wealth. But unfortunately, to continue to go through life, he now had to go it alone. Mom died suddenly and quickly. She just didn't wake up one day. It turned out that she had suffered from a heart defect since childhood, but stubbornly hid it from everyone. It was her style not to bother or worry her loved ones. Therefore, no one even suspected of the disease. Adriana still remembered that terrible day when her mother was gone, how her father screamed when he found his wife dead. The girl had crammed herself into a closet out of fear and didn't come out of there until the evening. The realization that in her life will never be a mother again came much later, when she and her father had to adjust their lives together. The relationship with her father was much more complicated, though Adriana respected and obeyed him immensely. But her father was harsh, categorical, and demanding. He did not approve of his daughter's choice of profession, so he forced her to leave art school in high school and to prepare for a serious university in a useful, as he said, specialty. Adriana realized that her father did it out of good intentions. After all, he repeatedly said that he would leave all his fortune to her, and she, in turn, should properly dispose of it. But the girl was far away from all this, thinking and dreaming of something else entirely. Of course, she was accustomed to the comfortable conditions in which she lived, but all this seemed to her secondary, not requiring to sacrifice her dreams. The sunset today was unusual, crimson, maroon from the brilliance of the sun that had rolled over the horizon, as if it were throwing splashes, illuminating everything around it. At such moments, Adriana tried with bated breath to transfer to canvas the beauty before her. Looking at the screen of her phone, the girl realized her father would be back soon, and he always demanded that his daughter be home at that time, waiting for his return. And despite the fact that Adriana was already old enough, her father tried to control her every move. Throwing a sad glance at the evening surface of the lake, she hurriedly gathered her things and moved towards home. Together with her father, they lived in an elite settlement within the city. Their house was quite large and well-maintained, and there were even a few servants on staff. The gardener took care of the grounds, the maids did the cleaning, and the cook worked in the kitchen. They also had an elderly woman who was the oldest of the servants and had the position of steward. Long ago, she had been Adriana's nanny, and when the girl grew up, the owners could not part with this kind woman. And since she was quite lonely, she herself was happy to stay in this family. She loved the girl very much. Adriana also loved Christina very much, and after her mother's death, she began to treat her especially reverently. And today, Christina was the first to meet the girl after the walk. "Well, where are you getting to?" "Soon after all father will be back," grumbled she. "The sunset fascinated me so much that I could hardly tear myself away." Adriana smiled dreamily. "Oh, my dreamer," the woman hugged the girl affectionately. "Now get dressed and come down for dinner," she added. After taking a shower and tidying up, Adriana went down to the living room where her father was already waiting for her. "Hello, daughter. Will you join me for dinner?" asked her father as if Adriana had never done so before. "Of course, Daddy," the girl replied affectionately and followed her father. Christina was also present at dinner as a real member of the family, despite her strictness. James respected the woman immensely. "Your birthday is coming up," Father spoke. "I've prepared a surprise for you," he said mysteriously. "What kind of surprise?" Adriana tensed. It always alarmed her when her father spoke in riddles, not to rush things. "The birthday is still 2 months away. You'll find out everything a little later. Right now, you have to pass the session." Father continued the meal in silence. It meant that the conversation was over, and no one present tried not to break the silence. It annoyed him when the table was noisy. Adriana looked sadly at her mother's portrait, which stood nearby on the shelf. The woman was smiling a radiant smile. Mom was the complete opposite of her father. She was always fun and easy to be with. Yes, and the father was much softer, being under the influence of the charms of his charming wife. Lately he'd been unbearable. Deep down, Adriana was even afraid of him. From Christina, she learned that her father had serious problems with business. That explained his irritability. Finished with dinner, the girl went to her room. Soon to be 19, and she had never had a relationship with a guy. Where would they come from, though? After all, her father controlled her every move. Immersed in unhappy thoughts, the girl shuddered when she heard the phone ringing. "My girl, hello, how are you?" called favorite aunt, Mom's sister. "Everything is fine," sadly answered Adriana, but having grasped, cheerfully asked, "How are you? I haven't seen you for 1,000 years. I missed you very much." Adriana tried to hide the excitement caused by this call. Memories of her mother were again troubling her soul. She remembered how they had visited Aunt Nancy in the village, and the time spent there had been one of the happiest memories of her childhood. "So that's actually why I'm calling." Aunt Nancy's voice was still cheerful and cheerful. "In short, I'm inviting you to come and visit me for the summer. They say it's going to be hot. We'll go swimming with you to the river." Well, how about it? The question hung in the air, and though Adriana already saw herself in the village, it would be rash to give an answer without consulting her father. "Aunt Nancy, I have a session to attend. Only after that I might be able to come, and my father must be consulted." Adriana heard a sigh of disappointment on the other end of the line. "But don't worry. I'll do my best. I'm very eager to tell you." She tried to cheer up her aunt. They agreed that Adriana would call next week and said goodbye. The village. Adriana had always envied the people who lived there. Of course, they had to work a lot harder than the city folk, and the labor was mostly physical, but they saw so much beauty every day. A wide river full of all kinds of fish, a huge deciduous forest with its gifts, fields surrounding the village from almost all sides, a holy spring, beating from under the ground, giving people crystal clear water. And this was by no means a complete list of things Adriana could bring. Several days had passed since her aunt's call, and thoughts of a possible trip to the village did not leave Adriana for a moment. Perhaps she wanted to visit once more the place where she had been so happy. After all, For the last few years, she had felt unwanted by anyone. Her father had been preoccupied solely with his career, as if trying to escape his grief at work. Of course, Aunt Nancy often called, especially after the death of her sister, tried to support morally favorite niece, although she herself experienced the loss strongly. But all this was not the same. You needed someone close by to feel warm and know that someone needed you. Was the session coming to an end? Approaching the moment of the imminent conversation with her father, berating herself for being afraid of her own father, Adriana rehearsed the upcoming speech. She had hardly seen him lately, as he literally slept at work. But one day she managed to catch her father at home. He was sitting in his office when Adriana knocked timidly on the door. "May I? I wanted to talk to you." Adriana asked shyly, closing the door. "Yes, come in," her father answered absent-mindedly. He kept his eyes on the laptop, wiping the sweat from his forehead, the 3-day stubble and the wrinkled shirt alerting Adriana. Her father had always been a great pedant about everything, and his appearance had always been impeccable. But not today. Sitting down in the large leather chair across from her father, Adriana decided to start the conversation. "Aunt Nancy called me yesterday." Quietly, the girl began the conversation. "It's good that she doesn't forget you. How is she doing?" James answered, still staring at the monitor. "She's doing fine, but she's offered me something and I'd like to discuss it with you." Adriana exhaled. "Discuss?" Her father raised his eyebrows in surprise. Finally, distracted. "Okay, I'm listening." "Aunt Nancy has offered to stay with her this summer, and I'd really like that." "Sure, if you don't mind." Adriana asked, lowering her voice. "Good. Go and have fun at the same time. On one condition, you have to be home by your birthday. I hope you haven't forgotten that we're having a big party." Adriana couldn't believe her happiness. She didn't think her father would even approve of the idea. "Thank you, Dad." Adriana stood up and walked over to her father and hugged him tightly. James kissed her on the top of her head and stroked her head affectionately, just as he had done when she was a child. Adriana was touched, especially when she noticed the tears in her father's eyes. "That's it, go daughter. I have work to do." Abruptly, he said, going back to work again. Adriana didn't bother to interrupt. All the more, what she had come here for had been accomplished. But in her heart, she felt inexplicable, wistful, and sad. That evening she called her aunt, informing her of her imminent arrival, which caused a storm of positive emotions on her part. A few days later she packed her things, going to the train, the ticket for which she had bought in advance. Already sitting on the train, she was anticipating how she would spend her vacation. Everything was new to her, starting with traveling on her own. In fact, despite her advanced age, she had never traveled anywhere, so when she fell asleep to the clatter of the wheels, the smile never left her face. Early in the morning, standing on the almost deserted platform, Adriana breathed in the fresh air, the air that took her back to her childhood. "Adriana? God, how long has it been since we've seen each other?" Her aunt threw herself on her neck, and when the hottest moments of the first meeting had passed, she looked at her niece from head to foot. "How beautiful you are! I can't believe it." The aunt whistled, and they both laughed. Grabbing half of Adriana's things, Aunt Nancy strode towards the motorcycle with the cradle where her neighbor was waiting for them. Adriana smiled as they rode through a large field, planted with nothing. Such an expanse for painting she hadn't seen in a long time. A multitude of wildflowers were stacked in whimsical islands, forcing her imagination to plan their arrangement on the canvas. A warm breeze blew her hair out of its braid, and despite the violent shaking, Adriana was happy. "I've made you a bed. It's much cooler here. It's very stuffy in the house now," Auntie commanded. After unpacking her things, Adriana went out onto the porch and looked at the familiar, but almost forgotten outlines of the neighbors' houses. Nothing seemed to have changed since she had been here with her mother. "Let's go to lunch, sweetheart." Putting a hand on her shoulder, Aunt Nancy spoke. Adriana brushed away a sudden tear and followed her. They were to dine in the garden, in a gazebo surrounded by a thicket of grapes. It was strange, but she and her father never ate in the garden, even though it was beautiful, preferring to do so only at home. And here, dining al fresco seemed so obvious that Adriana ate even more than usual. If it goes on, waking up, barely the sun showed from behind the horizon. The girl took her easel and went out to the backyard, where she had a beautiful view. After making a few sketches, Adriana hurried to help her aunt at breakfast, anticipating the trip to the lake. The freedom of movement made her wildly excited, and walking through familiar and dear to her heart, she was plunged into a carefree and happy childhood. "Are you settling in?" Aunt Nancy asked. "Yes, a little. The nature here, of course, is crazy." Adriana shared her impressions. Although Auntie saw everything perfectly well, those bright and cheerful eyes reminded her so much of her sister. Only it was noticeable that Adriana was stiff and as if she was afraid of being judged for any of her actions. "This is not a city. It's a real place to live," the woman replied thoughtfully. They had a quick snack, some of the food they had brought with them, and put it in the basket. They grabbed their beach gear and headed to the beach by the lake. The splendor before the girls' eyes was astounding. The boundless lake with the clearest water was surrounded by pine trees on 3 sides. Perhaps the landscape is not inferior to foreign resorts. Adriana smiled. "You should have brought an easel. You'll have time, believe me, and today let's go sunbathing and swimming." Aunt Nancy nodded towards the blanket she had spread out. Adriana took off her sundress, leaving her in a fashionable bronze-colored swimsuit. She had taken care of the purchase of this article of clothing in advance, knowing that she would definitely be swimming in the local body of water. Suddenly, the girl felt someone's gaze on her. Turning around, she noticed a familiar group of young people who had passed by their house last night. Looking at her was still the same guy as yesterday. Only today his gaze was a little different. Today it was as if he was studying her, unashamedly examining her from head to toe. That piercing gaze made Adriana uncomfortable. She sat down next to Aunt Nancy and pulled out a book, trying to concentrate, but it wasn't working, so she glanced around at the group. Suddenly, one of the girls walked up to the guy and literally hung around his neck. Adriana looked at him disappointedly and turned away, feeling a strange feeling. After lying in the hot sun for a while, Adriana and her aunt decided to take a dip. Her eyes involuntarily cast a glance at the place where that very company was resting. But this guy Adriana did not notice. Instead, she saw the girl who was with him, who now sat alone and was obviously upset about something. The water in the lake was really beautiful, despite the fact that it was quite cool. According to Auntie's story, the reason for this was because of the underground springs flowing directly into the lake. Adriana and Aunt Nancy came home in the late afternoon and started cooking dinner. "You won't believe it, but I haven't had such a wonderful time in a long time," Auntie confessed. "There was no suitable company. You know, when my husband died, I thought my heart would burst with sadness, but time heals. I realized that my business on this earth was not yet finished. And though fate didn't reward me with children, I have you, and I haven't felt as good as I do today in a very long time." Aunt Nancy brushed away her tears. Adriana rushed to comfort her. Aunt Nancy, why don't you move in with us? We have a big house, and Daddy, I think, will not mind," suggested the girl. "No, honey, I belong here. It's where I belong, and it's where I'll end up. But I want you not to forget this place. After all, this house will be yours when I die." Adriana did not answer anything. She pressed Aunt Nancy against her chest and stroked her wavy hair, from which gray strands came out. After they had cried enough, they went back to the houses. It was getting dark, but Adriana didn't want to go to bed. She went out onto the veranda and brought a warm blanket and a cup of herbal tea. Leaning back in the old armchair, she looked up at the stars and dreamed. Hearing the creak of the wicket door opening, the girl shuddered. On the path directly to her stepped the same young man, carrying a bouquet of wildflowers. The girl froze from fear and excitement at the same time, but did not move. "Hello, stranger. I'm sorry to intrude, but I had no other choice. I didn't know where or when I could see you again." The guide looked her straight in the eyes and smiled. "This is for you," he said, holding out the flowers to her. Adriana accepted them and gave the young man her radiant smile. "May I sit down?" he asked. "I suppose you may, but you have to introduce yourself." The girl answered not bravely, trying to hide her excitement. "Ethan," the young man answered immediately. "And you, Adriana, are you? How do you know?" She was surprised. "I had to find out." The boy smiled. Adriana noticed a shadow in the window of the dark room and realized that it was watching them, but she did not interfere with their acquaintance. "Would your girlfriend be unhappy that you came here?" she decided to ask Adriana. It was a question that had been on her mind ever since she had seen them hugging on the beach. "I don't have a girlfriend. Lisa is just a friend. We rent a house near you for the second summer in a row. There are 5 of us, 3 boys and 2 girls. We all go to a university in the city together. We saw this place by chance, but we fell in love with it." Ethan's voice was so pleasant that Adriana was ready to listen to it all night. Finally, the tension between them was gone, and Adriana even decided to tell him briefly about her life. The time passed quickly, and they said goodbye when dawn was about to break. Adriana immediately fell asleep in her cozy bed with thoughts of her new acquaintance. Meanwhile, Ethan returned to the house where his friends were waiting for him. "How did it go?" Michael asked. "Good girl. She seemed to like me. I think I'm going to win this bet," answered Ethan. "We'll see." Michael had set Ethan up for a bet when they were at the lake. Noticing the look in his friend's eyes, he said, "She's a cool girl, but I don't think you'll get anywhere. She's not likely to look at the average guy. That girl's not your type, bro." But Ethan looked at him with burning eyes, unable to look away. He really liked her very much, but his friend's words struck a blow to the young and proud lad's ego. "You'll see, she'll be mine. With heat," he said. "Want to bet?" Michael got into the game, you bet. The other friends didn't say anything about the bet, and Lisa was the only one who heard. She liked Ethan very much and followed him around, dreaming of getting him, but the boy didn't seem to notice all her attempts to get closer to him. That evening she followed him and saw him going to Adriana's place. The resentment and anger was very strong, but she tried not to give the appearance that she knew everything. Adriana greeted the new day with the sun shining through the window. She smiled as she stretched sweetly, remembering last night. "Wake up, sleepyhead. It's time for breakfast," her aunt called her affectionately. "5 minutes and I'll be ready," Adriana said. She quickly slipped her feet into her slippers and hurried to the bathroom. After changing her clothes, she went into the kitchen when everything was ready for breakfast. "I'm sorry, I didn't help you at all, she apologized. Come on, it's my pleasure to take care of you. You don't know how important it is to know you have someone to take care of you. Feeling like she might cry at any minute, she decided to change the subject. By the way, I heard voices under our window tonight. She looked questioningly at her niece, smiling slyly. Yes, that guy we saw at the lake came by. He wanted to meet me. Adriana's face flushed. Well, I hope he succeeded. He did. The girl blushed even more. I just don't know how to behave around guys, she admitted. You don't need to know anything. If you like him, act like your heart tells you to. Just be yourself, the woman replied. They had a lot of things planned for the day, so Adriana could only get free in the evening, and just as she entered the house, she heard a soft knock on the door. Opening it, she froze in place. Ethan was standing in front of her, holding a bouquet of wildflowers in his hand. Thank you. The girl smiled, accepting the bouquet. How would you like to go for a walk in the village? I don't know. I need to shower and change, the girl replied excitedly. She was desperate to go for a walk with him. Great. I'll wait on the porch. I hope your aunt won't mind. I don't think so. Adriana shrugged. When Ethan was out the door, she rushed into the shower, thinking about what outfit to wear for the walk. She smiled at her reflection in the mirror and stepped out. Ethan was sitting on the veranda with Aunt Nancy, drinking tea and talking nicely when Adriana came up to them. Adriana, there's a guy asking for permission to go for a walk with you. I had to meet him so I can let you go with him in peace. Adriana looked at her questioningly. I can see he's a good guy, so I'm letting him go. Seeing her niece's tension, she hurried to leave them alone. Ethan behaved much more easily today than the day before. He joked a lot and told interesting stories. Adriana learned that he was studying to be a doctor and dreamed of becoming a serious specialist in cardiology, and she, in turn, told about her passion for painting. Cool. Can I see your paintings with interest? Asked Ethan. They are all left at home in my studio, but I can paint a painting especially for you, she offered. That would be great. The boy was delighted. Ethan behaved very gallantly, not allowing himself anything extra. The walk ended in the late afternoon, leaving both of them with only positive emotions. From that day on, the young people were inseparable. Ethan went to fetch Adriana in the morning, and sometimes they returned in the morning. Aunt Nancy did not discourage their meetings. On the contrary, she liked Ethan very much, and she could see that her niece was truly in love. Adriana felt that Ethan was her man, but even if he wasn't rich, that wasn't the main thing. The main thing was that she realized that he had the same feelings for her as she did. Of course, her father may be against their relationship, but Adriana tried not to think about it and just enjoy communication with her beloved. The couple often discussed joint plans for the future, where they could not imagine that they could not be together. This is the first time I have this, said Ethan, sitting on the shore of the lake, which became their favorite place for dates. I can't be without you for a minute. I've had girlfriends before too, but that doesn't compare to how I feel about you. The guide pulled Adriana to him and kissed her gently. What about Lisa? Did you go out with her too? The girl asked, smiling. No. Although I know she wants to be with me, but now I don't need anyone but you. Ethan looked Adriana straight in the eyes. I will love you always, no matter what happens, he whispered, not taking his eyes off her. She was a little embarrassed, because it was the first time she had ever heard such words. Nevertheless, the vacation was coming to an end, bringing the inevitable parting with her lover, with her aunt, and with this beautiful place, which had given her so many wonderful moments that Adriana felt that she had not lived a real life before this trip. Though she and Ethan had agreed that they would meet as soon as they arrived, an inexplicable sadness never left Adriana. "Tonight is our last night. Tomorrow you will leave," Ethan said sadly. "You make it sound like we'll never see each other again." Adriana smiled, snuggling up to the guy who was the most important person in her life. They were sitting on a cliff surrounded by pine trees. There was a beautiful view of their favorite lake. Ethan grabbed a blanket and a picnic basket of food. "I haven't told you, but I love you very much as I possibly can." Ethan professed his love, looking Adriana straight in the eyes. There was no doubt in his sincerity. He gently touched her lips with his, pulling Adriana close to him. Tonight they decided to spend the night together, as if it was their last time together. This time, their date didn't end until dawn. In the evening, Adriana had already bought a train ticket. "I will definitely come to see you off." Ethan whispered goodbye. As she packed her things, Adriana remembered her promise to give Ethan the painting. Speaking of which, it was already finished. She wanted to leave him something to remember it by. She gathered herself, grabbed the gift, and headed toward the house where Ethan lived with his friends. As she got closer, Adriana felt a strange excitement, but continued on her way. The door was opened by Lisa. "Please call Ethan," Adriana asked. "Ethan has gone to town. Didn't you know?" Lisa looked at the confused Adriana with undisguised gloating. "Why would he report to you, though? Who are you? He got everything he wanted from you." The girl laughed. "I don't know what you're talking about." Adriana sat down on the bench outside the house, feeling her legs shaking from the sudden realization. What's there to understand? Ethan had bet with the boys that he'd get you into bed. You were so unapproachable at first, and then yesterday he told me what happened. He got fed up with you, so he left. Understand? Adriana couldn't believe what she was hearing. After all, she felt Ethan loved her. Could one play a crush so skillfully? She heard Adriana say something else in her back, but she hurried out of the place. Waiting for the train on the platform, Adriana looked at the faces of passers-by, wishing she could see the one she loved among them. And she hoped that he would explain everything to her, hug and comfort her, but time passed and he was still not there. "Honey, what's wrong? Your face is gone." Her aunt was worried, seeing her off. Of course, she understood who her niece was looking for in the passers-by. It's all right. Thank you for a wonderful vacation. If it hadn't been for you." Adriana stammered and cried, throwing herself on her neck. After sobbing for a few minutes, they heard the announcement of an incoming train and hurriedly calmed down. It never came. Adriana's mind was spinning as the train moved off, so Lisa was telling the truth. She concluded. She had some time to think about it. Eventually, she realized that it was exactly as the girl had said. Otherwise, how else would she have known that they had intimacy yesterday? Thinking about the fact that he had easily, or maybe even in great detail, told his friends about it was vile and disgusting. How could he? Resentment gradually replaced anger. Her father's driver was waiting for her on the platform, carefully packing her things into the car. The house met with the usual cold silence. It even seemed to Adriana that the vacation was just a dream. A note from her father, lying on the table in her room, said she would see him tonight and have an important conversation. Glancing at the portrait of her mother on the shelf, Adriana could barely hold back her tears. Suddenly she realized that she had no one to share her worries with. A little later, Christina came in. She sincerely missed her pupil, and so did Adriana, but something in her behavior was bothering her. The woman threw pitying glances in Adriana's direction, and when she asked for questions, she changed the subject. Her father came late in the evening, when Adriana had given up hope of waiting for him and was about to go to bed. He knocked gently on the door of her room. "Are you awake?" he asked, and after receiving a negative answer, he quietly entered the room and sat down in the chair opposite his daughter. Adriana realized that she missed her father very much. For a moment, she wanted to throw herself into his arms, cuddling like a little girl. But assessing the situation, she changed her mind. Her father hadn't seen her in almost 2 months, and not a single muscle on his face showed any emotion when they met. Adriana's heart clenched. Glancing at her mom's picture, Adriana dared to ask, "What did you want to talk to me about?" "Your birthday is coming up. I've decided to organize an evening at the Count's restaurant. Many important people will be there." "I'll introduce you to a lot of people," Dad said. "Thank you, but why do I need those people? I'd rather celebrate my birthday in a family circle." Shyly objected the girl. "It's out of the question. I've decided everything. Besides, the preparations for the party are in full swing. You should outshine everyone. You have time to prepare." The father stood up and headed for the door. "Good night," he said and walked out. Adriana sat on the bed with her legs tucked up. The phone vibrated, announcing an incoming message. It was her aunt writing, worried. Adriana smiled. It had probably been a long time since she had received such warmth. Communicating with Aunt Nancy helped to distract her from unpleasant thoughts for a while. Saying goodbye, the girl fell into a deep sleep. The new morning greeted her with drizzling rain and cold wind. The sky was covered with bulky gray clouds, giving no chance for a single ray of light to penetrate. Adriana sighed heavily, looking out the window. The weather reflected the state of her soul to the fullest extent. Every minute she thought of Ethan and what he had done. Her heart leaped out of her chest, and tears welled up in her eyes at the memory of him. Wrapping herself in a warm blanket, Adriana went to her small workshop. There she was finally able to forget. Taking in her hands brushes and paints, the girl plunged into painting. Remembering the native features of the face, Adriana wrote a portrait of her beloved that broke her heart. The girl did not notice how the time flew by. She woke up only when she heard the sound of the front door opening and her father's loud voice. Looking down, Adriana was startled. Her father was clearly drunk, as evidenced by his awkward movements and his extremely wrinkled and unkempt appearance. "I said no, okay. To sell the factory is to declare bankruptcy. I'll find a way out," shouted James. Adriana stepped back so her father wouldn't see her. It was the first time she had seen him like that in her life. Something terrible must have happened, Adriana thought. She couldn't explain her father's behavior any other way. Slowly making her way to the kitchen so as not to run into her father, Adriana waited for Christina. "Adriana, what are you doing here at this hour?" Entering the kitchen, the woman raised her eyebrows in surprise. "I need to talk to you." "Did you see the state your father came in?" "Yes, but you shouldn't worry about that. He's been a bit tired lately." Apparently, he decided to relax. The woman spoke quickly, not looking into the eyes of her interlocutor. "Relax? He's wasted. I've never seen him like that." "What's wrong? Do you know anything about it?" "Am I the only one in the dark? I don't know anything, but I assure you it's all right. Now go to bed. It's getting late." Christina tried to end the conversation quickly. That night, Adriana didn't sleep well. The feeling of uneasiness did not leave her. Ethan's face and Lisa laughing at her were on her mind. So she woke up in a bad mood with a sore head. Her father was not present at breakfast, so Adriana resolutely went in search of him in his office. She was determined to find out what was going on with him. The door to the study was open, and she ventured in without knocking. James sat leaning back in his chair and thinking about something. His eyes were red, proving that he had spent the night without sleep. When he heard his daughter's footsteps, he flinched. "Adriana?" He was surprised to see her. "Come in, we need to talk." The girl sat down across from him and waited intently. "You're old enough to understand the things we're going to talk about. I hope to have your support." The beginning didn't promise anything good, so Adriana tensed inwardly. "My firm is in a critical state. I'm on the verge of bankruptcy, plus huge debts. What do I do about it?" "I don't know yet. But one thing is certain, you need to make arrangements for your future." James paused, trying not to look his daughter in the eye. "Your birthday is coming up. As promised, I'll throw you a big party." "But Dad..." Adriana wanted to reassure her father, for it was the first time in years that he seemed so pathetic, making him seem even smaller in stature. She wanted to argue that she didn't need the party, that she shouldn't spend money on it, which she didn't have, but her father interrupted her sharply. "The matter is settled. Please listen to me to the end and do not interrupt me. So this evening I will introduce you to your future husband." He finally finished. Adriana was so shocked that she was speechless for a while, and only after a few minutes she said in a quiet voice, "I don't understand how you can make such decisions for me. Who gave you that right? I am a free man. Besides, there is a man I am in love with, so your plans are not destined to come true." Adriana looked at her father defiantly, not expecting herself to be so bold. There was no response, so she stood up and went silently to her room. It was the first time she'd objected to her father, so it was particularly nasty, and even more so that he'd decided to control her fate without her knowledge. Opening the only surviving joint photo of her together with Ethan on her phone, the girl cried. For the next few days she tried not to leave the room unnecessarily. Her father, too, seemed to avoid communicating with her. She had learned from Christina that he was just as late coming home from work and almost always invariably drunk. The time on the calendar was drawing closer to her birthday. One night before going to bed, James came to reconcile with his daughter. He spoke so softly, was so affectionate, as he had been in his distant childhood when her mother was still alive. So Adriana melted and listened to her father. "All I'm doing is taking care of you, sweetheart. I don't want you to stay on the streets, because anything can happen. David, he's a good man and he's been wanting to get to know you, so don't push him away. He'll make a good husband." He said many other things about the mysterious groom, marveling at his intelligence and success. They talked until almost midnight, and Adriana promised to think hard. In the morning, it was barely dawn, and she decided to call her aunt for advice. She knew she was awake, for the village was a busy place from the early hours of the morning. She had seen it for herself. "Adriana, my girl, how good to hear you," said Aunt Nancy. Her voice brought an involuntary smile to her lips. "I wanted to say so much and ask so many questions, but the lump in my throat prevented me from doing either. How are you doing? Why don't you say anything?" Aunt Nancy asked cautiously. I don't know," said Adriana and exclaimed. The words mixed with tears flowed by themselves. Adriana was confused but recounted the events of the last few days. There was silence on the other end. "Aunt Nancy, has Ethan asked about me? Have you seen him?" Shyly, Adriana asked what she had long wanted to ask. "I haven't. They left the village the same day you did," Auntie answered. "Please, darling, don't cry. We'll think of something. I'll talk to your father. You can't marry against your will. It's the Stone Age," She was indignant. After a little more talk with her aunt, Adriana began to calm down, having received the support of someone close to her. Auntie promised to call back in a couple of days, assuring her that everything would be fine. She called back, except this time the conversation did not bring Adriana comfort. She confusedly advised her niece to take a closer look at David and not to take things lightly. Adriana was surprised at the change in Aunt Nancy's mood. After all, now everyone was against her. On the eve of the holiday, her father had brought her a fancy dress in which she was to appear before the guests. But Adriana did not want to have fun at all. Every evening closing in her studio, she put all her pain and longing in her paintings, and her thoughts carry her back to the short time she spent with her beloved. The events of the festive evening unfolded rapidly. At the appointed time, she and her father arrived at the restaurant. A lot of strangers frightened her and made her uncomfortable, but it should be credited to her father, because he practically the whole evening did not leave her a step away. Looking at the faces of the guests, Adriana wondered who David was. To her surprise, for almost half of the evening, he was not visible among the guests. A pleasant slow song began to play, and couples began to walk to the center of the room. When Adriana looked around, she didn't notice that she was alone. Her father had disappeared unnoticed. "Can the birthday girl do me this honor and dance this slow dance with me?" Adriana heard a man's voice behind her. When she turned around, she saw a man who, smiling, was looking at her intently. Without waiting for an answer, he pulled her to him and dragged her into the crowd of dancing couples. Throughout the dance, the stranger did not utter another word. Adriana waited impatiently for the music to end, for the man was clearly overstepping his bounds, pressing her so tightly that she could hardly breathe. Finally, the music ended, and he disappeared as quickly as he had appeared. Suddenly, a bright light came on, and her father's loud voice came through the microphone. "Dear friends, I am glad to welcome you to the birthday party in honor of the birthday of my only and beloved daughter." It was felt that James had already knocked over more than one glass of champagne. "In addition, I would like to introduce you to my future son-in-law and announce the engagement of my daughter and David." The guests clapped. Some even started whistling. Adriana was more excited than ever. Suddenly, the stranger with whom she had been dancing stepped towards her and put his arm around her waist and stood beside her. "Friends," the father continued, "I also want to inform you that David is my companion from today. Please love and welcome." A satisfied smile never left the face of the new bridegroom. He was obviously pleased with himself. He was enjoying himself, and Adriana was the only one among the crowd of guests who felt superfluous. She looked at the groom. She sighed louder than etiquette allowed. This was not the groom she had envisioned. She thought he would be about her age or a little older. She even thought she might get used to him and perhaps even like him. After all, it had happened more than once in some people's lives. Christina tried to assure her of that every evening, telling her various stories from the lives of people she knew. Adriana. In the old days, no one asked anyone about love. The parents of the bride and groom would agree, that's all. And over the years, people became a real family. A woman told me. That's how it was in the old days. Now everyone marries for love. And how can you love a man you've never met? What if we don't like each other? Adriana asked Christina. So how could I not like you? You can't find such beauty by day and night. But slowly, in the course of such discussions, Adriana began to set herself up for a favorable outcome of the acquaintance. After all, if he disgusts me, my father will not force me to marry him. The girl thought, and now standing near her fiancé, who was 10 or maybe 15 years older than her, Adriana found herself at a complete loss. Someone came up with congratulations, but she heard nothing at all. Ethan's face flashed back into her imagination, so dear and beloved, and that groom was standing there smiling arrogantly, holding her as if she were his property. The girl got out of his embrace and walked away from the crowd. Tears came to her eyes. Sitting down on the couch in the hall, she let the tears flow, making sure no one was around. Tears of happiness. She suddenly heard a woman's voice. A pretty, slender brunette stood next to her with a glass of champagne. "I'm sorry, Adriana couldn't find anything to say." "And what can you say to a stranger?" "Don't apologize, it's fine." "Betty." The stranger held out her hand and smiled. "I have a proposition. Why don't I get us some champagne in honor of our acquaintance?" Adriana nodded. "Why not?" It wouldn't hurt to relax and distract herself a bit right now. Betty seemed like a nice girl. They sat down at a table at the end of the room and chatted casually. "You're a nice girl," said Betty. "Although, to be honest, I thought you were an arrogant know-it-all, considering who your father is," confessed the new acquaintance. Adriana couldn't find anything to say, but smiled. "My fiancé dumped me today. Can you believe it? He just said that it's over between us, and he's marrying someone else." Betty spoke with pain in her voice. "How could he? You're so beautiful." Adriana tried to calm her down. "Apparently, money decides everything in this life. No one needs love," the girl replied sadly. "I believe in love, and you do too. He will definitely regret his deed and come back." Adriana didn't have time to finish, as she noticed that David and her father were approaching their table. "What are you doing here?" he asked Betty rudely. "Just congratulating the bride." "Don't worry, I was just leaving." Betty stood up and headed for the exit. "What right do you have to send my guests away?" Adriana asked sternly. "She wasn't on the guest list. Don't worry, dear. I'm just protecting you from unnecessary socializing." David smiled, but the smile seemed strained, more like a grin. "Let me decide for myself what kind of communication I want and what I don't want." Adriana objected rudely and, apologizing, followed Betty. Unfortunately for her, the girl had already left the restaurant. Adriana spent the rest of the evening avoiding everyone, including her father. She wanted to get home as soon as possible to get her thoughts together. When the evening was finally over, Adriana was relieved to enter her room and sit on her bed, completely drained of energy. There was no point in talking to her father tonight, but tomorrow the conversation would have to take place. That was what Adriana decided as she fell asleep. Waking up and without waiting for breakfast, the girl headed to her father's study. He was already there. "We need to talk." Adriana began abruptly. The father looked at his daughter with bewilderment. She had never used such a tone when talking to him. "I don't want to marry David. Please let him know that. The matter of your marriage is settled and is not subject to discussion." David's father repeated for the umpteenth time. "He's a very promising young man. You will certainly get along with him." "Young? He's at least 10 years older than I am. Besides, I didn't like him at all. He's arrogant and conceited. I don't want to marry him, Dad." Adriana couldn't help screaming. "Enough. I've already told you that my finances are bad and we could be left on the street. So I'm concerned about your future. Too bad, Daddy, that for the first time in my life, I'll have to go against your will. I want to love and be loved too. Have you forgotten what it's like to live with someone you love?" Adriana knew she had struck a nerve. Her father was still suffering from the loss of his wife and tried not to broach such topics with anyone. Suddenly, her father sank into a chair and lowered his head and sobbed. Adriana was shocked by what was happening, not knowing how to behave. "I have always loved your mother, just idolized. And believe me, I have not forgotten how happy it was," said my father through sobs. "After losing her, I focused on work, trying to distract myself from the pain and emptiness that settled in my heart. I put everything on the line for my success, but lately things have been going from bad to worse. Competitors have been digging at me, sending various inspections. I've had to suspend production. Creditors are demanding debts, and there is nothing to pay." David offered to work together and provide financial assistance. He has great connections in all structures, and in return, he wanted to become my son-in-law. Her father looked her straight in the eye. "Please, my daughter, agree. Don't break your old man's heart. I won't survive the loss of the firm." Adriana silently walked out of the office. There were no tears. Her thoughts were jumbled in her head. She went up to the studio and began to paint. She painted furiously, without stopping for a minute, and didn't leave until the next morning. Concerned, Christina was already waiting for her. "Adriana, what's wrong?" "Everything is fine." The girl replied dryly, "Tell my father that I agree. Let us start preparing for the wedding." When the door closed behind Christina, Adriana spoke aloud, looking at the picture of her mom. "I will do what he wants for you, Mom. I don't want him to suffer. And the fact that he made me a bargaining chip, let it remain on his conscience." From that day on, Adriana didn't care about anything that happened next. And then the days passed from one to the other in the hustle and bustle of the wedding. The endless fitting of the wedding dress and other preparations did not cause Adriana any interest. She saw David twice more when he came to see his father, and then only in passing. He seemed to have no tenderness or interest in the bride. On the day of the wedding, Adriana stood in her gorgeous wedding gown, trying to control her tears. A multitude of guests took turns saying their congratulations and wishing happiness and love to the young ones. The bride thought about her own thoughts and listened to almost nothing. Occurring periodically, nausea and dizziness did not give rest. The thing is that 2 weeks before the planned celebration, Adriana found out that she was pregnant. This news at first caused a wild horror, and then she realized that this way she would find the meaning of life, and the baby would be her salvation from loneliness. There was no doubt that Ethan was the father, as Adriana was not close to anyone else. This fact both pleased and frightened her. On the one hand, the child would have a part of her favorite man, and Adriana didn't want to have children from her unloved husband. But how would David feel about it? After all, he would surely find out. Adriana tried not to think about that for the moment. Aunt Nancy's absence from the party was worrying, because she wanted to see her most of all. But neither her father nor Christina could explain why Auntie was not on the guest list. Her phone was silent during all Adriana's attempts to call her. The groom talked more with the guests than with the bride. Only occasionally, under cries of bitterness, he roughly raked her into an armful for a kiss. When the celebration was over, she had to get home alone. Of course, a car with a driver was waiting for her near the restaurant. Otherwise, it could not be otherwise, given the financial situation of the newly married husband. Unfortunately, at the end of the next day, Adriana went to the doctor to register her pregnancy. The due date was almost 3 months. It had been exactly that long since she had last seen Ethan. She tried to keep thoughts of him out of her mind because they caused tears and worry, and she couldn't be nervous. She plunged into waiting for the baby. Adriana almost tried not to pay attention to the strange behavior of her husband, and there were strange things. Now he controlled her every move. She couldn't go anywhere without a driver, and only when she went to her father's house could she get away from the eyes that were always watching her. Adriana lacked socialization. That's why she found a note with Betty's phone number in the pocket of her coat and dialed the number. "Betty, this is Adriana. Remember at my birthday party?" "Of course I remember." Betty answered quickly. "How are you?" "Why don't we get together?" "I'd love to," Adriana answered. The girls agreed to meet in the park in the evening. The meeting went beautifully. The girls talked a lot about everything. It even seemed to Adriana that they had known each other for many years. "How was it, married?" Betty asked shyly. Sighing heavily, Adriana replied, "I don't know. We're strangers. We don't talk much. Only about the pregnancy. But I can't help it. I promised my father." Adriana felt tears come to her eyes. "Didn't you marry for love?" "Any girl would be happy to be David's wife." "Perhaps, but not me. I saw him for the first time on the day of the engagement, and my father had already made up his mind for me. And though my heart belongs to another man, I can't betray my father. It's important to him, and he is the only family I have," Adriana answered sadly. Betty was silent. For the rest of the walk, she was very thoughtful and taciturn. But saying goodbye, the girls agreed to meet again in a couple of days. The next morning, Adriana had an unpleasant conversation with her husband. "With whom did you meet yesterday?" he asked. As soon as Adriana came down for breakfast. "A friend. What does it matter? Or am I not allowed to do that anymore?" Adriana looked into David's eyes. His prickly gaze made her uncomfortable. "Okay, here's the deal. I forbid you to see her. Is that clear?" he asked, raising his tone. "What right do you have to control my life?" Adriana shouted, unable to hold back her tears. "I am not your property, David. You are mistaken, my dear, and you'll soon find out." Her husband's haughty smile resembled a grin. Adriana stood up silently and went to her room, wiping away her tears. The next evening, she decided to have a serious talk with her father. It couldn't go on like this. Going into her father's study, she began at once about the main thing. "Father, I can't go on like this. I want a divorce." Hearing her words, her father turned very pale. "Are you crazy, daughter? How could you think of such a thing?" In the evening, David told her that his cousin and his fiancée were coming to visit them the other day. "Please prepare everything for their arrival," he said sternly. "Everything must be dignified. I hope you understand me?" Adriana nodded in response. Selecting an outfit to meet the guests, Adriana wore a soft blue dress in the color of her eyes, a little loose cut, though it was hard not to notice her belly, which was growing by the day. At Adriana's orders, the servants had prepared a festive dinner of poultry and numerous appetizers. As she made her way down to the table, Adriana heard the sound of voices coming from the parlor. Apparently, David had arrived at the same time as the guests, because his voice was the most audible. For a moment, Adriana froze. One of the voices sounded very familiar. Her heart was pounding frantically. Her legs became absorbent cotton. The girl could not move from her seat. "Meet my dear brother, my wife Adriana." David introduced her. Ethan stood in front of her, amazed as much as she was, and extended his hand. "Nice to meet you, Ethan," he said. Behind him stood Lisa, smiling wryly. For a moment, Adriana thought she was going to faint. Noticing the pallor on her face, Ethan asked, "Are you all right? You don't look well." "Don't worry, brother. It's just that my wife is pregnant, and I'm going to have an heir soon." David laughed. "Congratulations," Ethan replied quietly. "Well, let's get to the table." Invited the owner of the house. At the table, Ethan sat across from Adriana and kept his eyes on her. Lisa was angry and tried to distract her fiancé. "I'm sorry, David, that we couldn't come to your wedding." Ethan is literally obsessed with his studies, and after he was invited to work at the Heart Center, I don't see him at home. Lisa defiantly hugged Ethan defiantly with a challenging look at a pale Adriana. "I hope you'll definitely come to our wedding." "Will it be soon?" David asked. "We haven't decided anything yet, so it's too early to talk about it." Ethan cut in. Adriana was silent. It was obvious that she was hurt by these words. When it was time for the hot pot, David suddenly shouted, "Who do you think is going to eat this crap?" He turned to his wife, pointing at the forbidden turkey. "I thought everyone would like it." Adriana replied, confused, "Next time, before you think with your chicken brain, consult your husband." David couldn't stop. Apparently, the strong drinks were already doing their job. "I don't see what the problem is. I have a lot of respect for turkey." Ethan stood up for Adriana. "Don't," she whispered, looking at him. Tears glistened in her eyes. She left the table and quickly went to her room. "Why do you treat your wife like this, and even pregnant? Hasn't time changed you at all?" Ethan asked. She deserved it. "Besides, I don't need counselors." David answered rudely. "I agree with David. Why serve something your husband doesn't like?" Lisa interjected. "Shut up already. You've said enough today." Ethan looked at Lisa with irritation. "Why did you come here?" "I don't suppose it was out of great affection for your cousin?" David asked, and the men went out to the veranda to continue their conversation in private. Adriana was crying in her room. The feelings that were overwhelming her were bursting out now. She realized that she still loved Ethan. That made the pain seem even worse. That evening, Ethan and Lisa stayed the night. Adriana realized this when she caught Ethan having a cup of coffee in the kitchen in the early morning. "Hi, will you join us?" Ethan asked. "No, thanks. I think you should wait for your fiancé, and I'll have tea in my room," answered Adriana. "Your room? Are you and David living in separate rooms? I'm sorry, but I don't think it's any of your business." Adriana sneered, and taking the cup of tea she prepared, she wanted to turn around and leave. She felt Ethan grab her arm. "I think we need to talk." Adriana looked silently into his eyes, in which she was drowning by the minute. She realized that the conversation was inevitable, but she tried to delay it. "What is there to talk about? How you bet your friends that you could easily get me into bed? Or maybe you want to tell me how long you laughed at me after it happened." Adriana's voice trembled, tears welling up in her eyes. "What argument? What stupidity? I was shocked when you left without even saying goodbye. I ran to your aunt, but she asked me to leave you alone. I begged her for your address, but she was adamant. I tried to find you, but I realized I didn't even know your last name." Ethan fell silent. "I don't believe you. Especially now it doesn't matter anymore." Adriana sighed. "You don't love him and you're unhappily married now, right? That's none of your business. You made your choice back then." Adriana pulled her hand out of his and ran upstairs. Her temples throbbed and her heart was pounding so hard that it felt like it would literally burst out of her chest. The girl dialed Betty's number and told her everything. "What do you think to do?" asked her friend. "I don't know." Adriana exclaimed, "I don't know anything." "Should you tell him that your baby is his?" Betty had long been privy to this secret. After all, lately she was the only person Adriana could share it with. The girl always sincerely sympathized with her friend, was aware of the rather strange relationship between her and her husband. He had a wedding coming up. Why would he want to know that? Perhaps Lisa would soon give him her children. Adriana replied sadly, "Don't be upset. We'll think of something." Besides, your father has promised to settle things and authorize the divorce. The most important thing is to stop being nervous. In your condition, it's dangerous for the baby." Talking to her friend calmed Adriana down a bit. She decided not to go downstairs that day, and the next day the guests were gone. The time passed, but the father could not get things sorted out yet. The pregnancy was coming to its logical conclusion, so Adriana was very worried. She had not seen Ethan again, although he had managed to give her his card with his contacts through the maid. David looked at her like she was nothing at best, and sometimes he snapped at her, picking on her for every little thing. On the due date, Adriana gave birth to a beautiful baby girl and named her Emily after her mother. When she looked at her, she was amazed. The baby was an exact copy of her father. Even the mole on her left cheek she inherited from him. She was met from the hospital by a driver sent by her husband and Christina and Betty. On the first evening at home, there was a scandal. David came home from work drunk and immediately blamed his wife. "How worthless you are. You can't even give birth to a son. I wanted a son and hair. And what's this?" He pointed to the cradle where the baby was sleeping quietly. "What are you talking about, David? You knew it wasn't your child from the start, but you pretended it wasn't. What hair are you talking about?" "Yeah, I can't have kids, okay? And I was counting on this baby. I mean, he was born in wedlock, which means no one would question our parentage. The girl was not part of my plans," he shouted. "Don't you worry, we'll be going home soon, and you won't have to endure our presence." Adriana replied, as calmly as possible. David laughed and pushed Adriana against the wall. "You're wrong," he hissed. "You have nowhere to go back to. Everything your father has is signed over to me. I've got him on a tight leash. He won't say a word against me. So unless you want me to throw him out on the street in his pants, and you and your baby. Anyway, my dear wife, I advise you to think very carefully." "What's all this for?" she asked, hardly breathing. "The time will come, and you'll know everything. Be patient, my dear. But I warn you not to be silly, otherwise Daddy or Nurse may suffer, and maybe our daughter." David burst into wild laughter. The baby cried. Adriana rushed to comfort the child. Adriana was stunned. She realized that David was not normal, and now she was even more afraid of him. She had only been able to call her father once. From the conversation, she realized that she would not get support from him. He was clearly not himself, habitually mumbling to her to bear with her a little longer. David had organized a party to celebrate the birth of the child. All his friends and Ethan and Lisa were invited. The party took place in the living room on the first floor, so Adriana preferred not to go down to the guests for fear of leaving the baby alone for even a moment. Suddenly there was a knock at the door. It was Ethan. "May I?" he asked shyly. Adriana nodded silently. Ethan walked over to the crib and looked at the baby. "She's so cute. I've never seen such pretty babies," he smiled. Adriana's heart sank as she watched the tenderness with which Ethan looked at his daughter. "I wish he hadn't noticed the resemblance," Adriana repeated to herself. The girl cried, and she immediately picked her up in her arms. "Motherhood suits you. You are even more beautiful," Ethan said affectionately. Adriana could hardly keep herself from throwing herself at his neck and telling him how she felt and who he was to her daughter. But suddenly, almost at the very door, Lisa's voice sounded, searching for Ethan. "You have to go," Adriana said sadly. "I hope I'll see you again. At least, I'd like that very much," Ethan said quietly and walked out. 2 weeks later, the little girl fell ill. She had a fever. There were no other symptoms. She screamed all the time, and the antipyretics hardly worked at all. "Call a doctor, please," Adriana asked her husband. "No need to worry, it's just a cold," David assured her. "Please, the child is not well. Can't you see?" she begged. "All right, the doctor will come here tomorrow," David replied indifferently. All evening the girl was capricious, and by night, Adriana realized that the matter was much more serious than she thought. The girl's lips began to turn blue, and an attack of suffocation caused a wild horror to her mother. Not knowing what to do, Adriana dialed Ethan's number on her business card. "Ethan, please help. My daughter is dying," shouted Adriana into the phone. "I'll be right there. Call an ambulance. Hurry, please." Adriana couldn't find a place to go. She hurriedly gathered the necessary things for herself and the baby and rushed downstairs with her daughter in her arms to wait for the ambulance. Ethan arrived at the same time as the ambulance and ordered them to take the girl to the cardiac center where he worked. David didn't come out to the noise. Apparently, he was fast asleep after taking another drink. "What's wrong with the baby?" she asked Ethan when he and the professor left the room. "The situation is complicated. The girl has a heart defect. Did any of your relatives have a similar condition?" asked the professor. "Yes, my mom," answered Adriana with trembling lips. "The girl needs an urgent operation. Do you give your consent?" "Yes, of course. Then we need to sign the necessary documents and start the preparations," declared the professor. At that moment, the phone rang in Adriana's pocket. "How dare you leave with the child without my knowledge?" shouted into the phone husband. "My daughter needs help, and I as a mother will do everything possible for this. We will not return to your house. I'll file for divorce myself." Adriana said what she had wanted to say for a long time. "What did you say? Divorce? There's one thing you haven't considered, dear. According to the papers, I'm the father of the child, and with my connections, I could easily take her away from you. You can't do that." Adriana turned pale, realizing the trap she had fallen into. "You're wrong. That's why it's in your best interest to go back. Otherwise, though, you'll see," said David and disconnected. Clutching the phone, Adriana felt a ringing in her ears and her eyes went dark. Ethan picked up the fainting woman and carried her to his office. Adriana woke up and smelled a pungent odor. "I really need your help." In a pleading tone, she began the conversation. Ethan nodded silently. "We have to register Emily under a false name, or he'll find us." Ethan didn't ask any more questions, but within an hour she had the child's card with the changed personal data. Adriana stayed with her daughter the whole time she was preparing for the operation, only leaving to wash or eat. Ethan was always there too. He knew that David was looking for his wife all over the city, but he didn't tell Adriana. The most important thing now was the outcome of the surgery. The girl had been operated on by one of the best cardiologists in the city. Ethan had assisted. The few hours that Emily was in the operating room seemed to Adriana like an eternity. And only when Ethan informed her that the worst was over and the operation was successful, Adriana was able to breathe out. She cried, throwing herself into Ethan's arms. "Emily, isn't she my daughter?" he asked a sobbing Adriana, gently stroking her hair. She nodded, and he pressed her even tighter. Later, sitting in the hospital cafe, the young people were drinking coffee and listening to the radio. Suddenly, the music was interrupted by an urgent news bulletin. It was reported about a major fire of one of the houses in an elite village of the city. Adriana was horrified to hear her father's address. Her father had died in the fire, suffocated and could not get out. Christina was badly injured and was in the hospital. Adriana rushed to her. The woman said that it was probably arson because the doors of the house were propped up from the outside. Because of this, they could not get out. She also told of a letter she had kept for Adriana. The letter was from your aunt. Don't swear, but I opened it, but I guess I've had to. It burned, but I read it. Your aunt has been ill lately, but her soul kept longing for you. She wanted to see you. She called many times. Only James forbade her to see you. He told her not to mess with your head. So she sent you a letter in pain. No one but me saw it. She bequeathed you a house in the village. She asked you not to abandon it, and at the end she signed it. I hope you will find true happiness at your roots. Christina was silent and closed her eyes. Adriana cried quietly. Suddenly she saw through the window David's car in the parking lot. She rushed down the hall, looking for an emergency exit, because Ethan was waiting for her in the car. Hurry up and find me, Adriana shouted, and the car started whistling. The mirror showed that David's Jeep was following them. God, he won't spare us. Hurry, Ethan, please, she prayed. David was gaining on them. One more leap, and he could have blocked their path. But as fate would have it, there was a fox in the oncoming lane, and David's car slammed into it at full speed. Ethan and Adriana were sitting in the emergency room. He wants to see you, the nurse announced. Adriana did not boldly enter the room where David was lying. He looked pathetic now. There were tubes literally everywhere, but he was conscious. My only regret is that I didn't finish what I started, he hissed. Why do you hate me so much? What am I doing to you? Because you were his daughter and you had to suffer. Like me, he met my mother before you were born. I was a little boy then. He tamed me. I adored him. And so did my mother. Then he met your mother and easily threw us out of his life. Mom couldn't take it anymore and started drinking. I was raised by relatives. All this time I was hatching a revenge plan and following his life. You were born with a golden spoon in your mouth. You had everything, money, loving parents. I had nothing at all, you know. David looked contemptuously at the surprised Adriana. And then I set a goal to succeed, to trample your family, and I almost succeeded. Adriana did not listen anymore, but silently left the room. David survived, but became an invalid, confined to a wheelchair. He was being cared for by Betty, a friend of Adriana's. As it turned out, she had long been in love with him and had even dated him. At first, she was terribly jealous of Adriana, but after getting to know her better, she became warm to her and tried to dissuade David from his devious plans. A month later, Adriana and Ethan took the girl home from the hospital. They were on their way to their new home in the countryside, the one that bound their lives together forever. They were happy to be back to their roots,